Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. ¿Qué me dicen? What you guys saying? Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you guys making time to be here. Um, Today we're just gonna continue again investigating ancient America, its connections to so-called Atlantis, and it being part of the old world, in fact, being the true old world. And before we get into this book, I wanted to go ahead and remind you, if you go to my main page here on YouTube, you will be able to see different tabs. If you go to the playlist tabs, you'll find all different playlists I have ready for you. And one of them is Philology, Ancient America, where we have read another book, Comparative Philology, you know, Prehistoric and Protohistoric um, comparative philology research, and we got a lot of good drop on that. So if you want to go ahead and catch those, we're gonna make this part 4 of this series today. Again, the book we are getting into is Examination of the Legend of Atlantis in reference to Protohistoric Communication with America by Hyde Clark. All right, so we're going to dodge the hijack a little bit. We're going to pull out a lot of good information, but we're going to dodge the hijack a little bit. Again, they try to say people came here, not understanding that this is part of Atlantis, or that other people came here from other parts of the world, or vice versa. This is the true old world, but we're going to see what he has to say either way. This is from 1886. Says here, investigations as to American and other origins. All right, see what he has to say. It says, my historical investigations for some years have particularly borne upon the relations of America to the old world. They refer to the questions whether the populations and civilizations of the new world are there born and indigenous, or whether they are imported from the other hemisphere, and therefore in no respect distinct. All right, again, its relations with the old world. Upon anthropological grounds, it has been impossible for me to determine that no race is autochthonous or purely American. All right, he hasn't been able to disprove that. They might be indigenous, but this is absolutely certain that many of the populations are immigrants and many are mixed race. As a matter of hypothesis, the leaning must be on the general evidence to the conclusion that the population of America did not differ in the incidence of its origin from that of other regions of the earth, just like any other part of the earth. So there must be different nations here, right? Just like in any other parts of the world. They're not all just coming from one people, from a Bering Strait theory, The teachings of Professor Daniel Wilson, the apostle of prehistoric archaeology, had a natural influence in molding my own investigations, which have been still further favored by the liberal assistance of Dr. Hayden and his colleagues at the Smithsonian, Professor A. Graham Bell, Professor John Campbell of Montreal. All right, some hijacks here from the Smithsonian, huh? So who we dealing with here, really? So that's what I'm saying. Be ready to dash some hijack. When the migrations began remains in obscurity, but many of the phenomena of migration are illustrated by race, language, mythology, and culture. One incident has been dimly sketched out by me. That migration must have taken place during the epoch of gesture language, anterior to the development of speech language. In America, gesture language still is more extended and developed than in any region of the world, and it is a matter so important that it has engaged the special attention of Colonel Mallory and has become a branch of distinct investigation by the Ethnological Department of the United States scientific staff. There is no reason to suppose that gesture language was less developed in America at an early epoch or that it was non existent in the Eastern Hemisphere. From the Old World, many of Colonel Mallory's illustrations and those of Professor Graham Bell are derived. In particular, attention has been called by me to the gesture language of the mutes of the Seraglio at Constantinople, which constitutes a self-sufficient system and appears to represent that of the classic epic, as recorded by various writers with regard to mimes or memes and mimes, right? The people with the gestures and pantomimes. My reason for hypothesis that migration and the manifestations of culture took place during the epoch of gesture language, as well as afterwards, is founded on a consideration of the development of speech language from gesture language and the nature of the legends as to creation and language. That gesture language was derived from speech language and that the latter was anterior cannot be argued from the facts, and the connection of ideas between the two forms of language shows, as will be hereafter referred to, that a system of mythology, symbology, and culture already existed in gesture language, and it is upon these bases speech languages was constituted. My affirmation goes further than the assertion that there was an epoch of culture contemporaneous with gesture languages, for it seems impossible to avoid coming to this conclusion that ideographs, hieroglyphics, and characters existed in that epoch, and so existent were afterwards applied to speech language. There is a self-evident connection between some characters and some gestures, and this is independent of speech or phonetic relation. Characters of double lines, all right, like the ogam, look at that, represent sun and river in ancient paleography. And though it is true that in some languages the same sound stands for sun and river, the explanation of the character being double can only be accounted for by the record in Colonel Mallory that the sign for offspring is made by two hands and not by one hand. At the same time, the reserve must be maintained that while certain ideographs belonged to the earliest period, and that with them picture writing was made, and that these characters passed into syllabic or sound representations, yet that the latter system of writing on which our own is founded was greatly influenced by the physiological or psychological ideas thereby connected with sounds. It is quite possible that picture writing may still exist on rocks in America, such as those in Guyana and elsewhere, which belong to the infancy of mankind, all right, very old, and are deviations from the carvings which we recognize in such primitive abodes, as those in the caves of Dordogne, just like the ones in Europe. Of such inscriptions too there are survivals among the Indians of America, as they are a gesture language, and of so many institutions. It is in the epoch of speech language that we can safely trace many events of migration. It has been stoutly maintained that migration passed solely by the Pacific, and various circumstances have been brought forward on this side, and in particular a reference to China, of the origin of intercourse and the transmission of culture. That's what kind of like the main hijack mainstream teachings, right? That migration passed across Bering Strait, right? You see the Bering Strait theory, you see what I'm saying? That's the hijack that he's talking about right now. We know from the community, type, and languages of the Eskimos and other northern populations of America and Asia. So just because some people might have done it doesn't mean that there wasn't people already here. It doesn't mean that everybody took that route. It doesn't mean that people didn't travel from North America to South America or South America and North America or vice versa, The insufficiency of this sole route of passage has favored speculations for a Pacific Ocean route, and Mr. Park Harrison has largely dealt with this. His papers establish many points of community between the eastern and western hemispheres, such as have been followed by Dr. Donnelly and the Atlantis and others. The evidence, however, as examined by the lights we now have, does not necessarily establish a supremacy for a transmission from Asia across the Pacific, all right? That's not really what I'm learning here, he's saying. That's not what I see. Alexander von Humboldt showed us that the Mexican zodiac and the Chinese were of common origin. But this does not prove an origin from China, okay? That's what I've been trying to say. Just because you find the same exact things being practiced by other people in the world doesn't mean they brought that over here. It could have been in reverse. We brought it out from here, the true old world. That zodiac, the one in the Aztec side, could be more original based off Mayas and Olmec, right? And then the Chinese could be just a continuation, a duplicate, a copy. Like he says here, even that Alexander Vahama was saying, they have a common origin, all right? It doesn't mean that that's proof an origin from China, all right? There are so many resemblances of Mexican institutions with countries remote from China that we cannot set up a connection from an isolated fact which is destitute of general support. A case which has been strongly dwelt upon by Dr. Latam and others is the relation of the Gallinomero and Coahuaclamayo languages of the northwest coast of America to Chinese. All right, you hear that? So, where did the Chinese really learn to get their language from, huh? This relationship is again one of isolated facts, and the words cited are words which are not peculiar to Chinese. However, typical the Chinese language may appear to us as a whole, the Chinese, like all other languages, is only a later development from the general system, and the present Chinese does not represent the ancient words. Nevertheless, these facts show a resemblance of American words with Chinese as with other languages, which is commonly the case in all languages. It may be regarded as certain that migrations did take place across the Pacific, but this cannot have been the main or exclusive route. Okay, this is what I've been saying. That doesn't mean, yeah, maybe some people did come through there, and these Eskimos are related to some of the Siberians and Upper Russia and all that, and but that's not probably the only way people came. There was already people here either way, right? First of all, let's establish that there was already people here. Nobody had to come to populate the Americas. There's been people here since creation. This is the oldest land out of the primordial waters. You understand? The true old world. But if other people did come from other parts of the plane, maybe coming back to the motherland, it wasn't the only way. Like the Bering Strait wasn't the only way, is basically what he's saying. Okay, that's not the exclusive route. The Pacific Ocean must have been known at an early date, for it is recognized in the doctrine of the four worlds, as has been pointed out by me. There, the Pacific divides the Americas from the Eastern Hemisphere and Australia. It is, however, this doctrine of the four worlds which shows that the Atlantic was equally well known as lying between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Americas. All right, there is a doctrine, old ancient doctrine, that that people knew that there was four parts of the world, not just three continents, like saying Asia, Africa, and Europe. Indeed, it is the first doctrine of the four worlds which has been dwelt upon by me as the key to the olden knowledge of America and the Eastern Hemisphere, afterwards lost in oblivion. Okay, yeah, the people knew that America existed, that this continent was here, the four continents, the four worlds, that the earth is a globe was a most ancient doctrine, thus the hijack of astronomy. It may be regarded as protohistoric, if not prehistoric. You mean a plane with a firmament, where we find a record of the distribution of land on its surface and a doctrine taught in the school of Pergamus in Asia Minor. This doctrine, neglected by the general mass, had nevertheless such fascination that it lingered in classic and in Christian times, even to the days of Columbus, only to be effaced by his discoveries, to which this record of the past led it, if it did not inspire them. Okay, and again, here we go again. Another person telling you Columbus knew he was never lost. He knew about the four worlds, the four continents. He knew about that. This system was notably maintained by crates of Pergamos, 160 BC. All right, from Reynolds' Journal Asiatique, Volume 1. And it is also referred to by Virgil in the Aeneid. There appears to have been a tradition of an imperial title of monarch of the four worlds offered to Augustus by his flatterers. By me, this is connected with a statement of Mr. George Smith that Agu, an ancient king in Babylonia, called himself king of the four races. The empire of the Incas was called Tavintin Susu, or four quarters of the worlds, as stated by Prescott, all right? And that's a fact. Conquest of Peru, Book 1, Chapter 2. All right. Quoting on the Garli, Real Prim manuscript, it says Kita and Kita Peruvian epic. Listen, there's a whole book he got on this. Hittites, Kita. Europe, Asia, and Africa were described as a continent, occupying the northern portion of one side of the earth, the chief error being in the limit given to the southern extension of Africa. This continent was balanced in the south by an austral continent being Australasia and Australia. On the other side of the earth, each continent was balanced, one by a northern continent and the other by a southern continent, representing the Americas. These continents were separated from each other laterally by oceans passing from pole to pole, being the Atlantic and Pacific, and supposed to be divided between north and south by a belt of ocean. That the eastern continent and Australia are so divided is a fact, and North and South America are so thinly joined that they are nearly divided. The legend perhaps had reference to the fact that communication could be made from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean by portages across the isthmuses. This delineation of the earth and of the Americas is too close to be accidental. It appears to be derived from intercourse and observation. This intercourse is confirmed by numerous facts of anthropology, language, and mythology published by many of us and those who went before us, as to language, notably by Alexander von Humboldt and Garnett. That the knowledge of this intercourse was not wholly lost is shown by the legend of Atlantis. Of late years, this legend again occupies attention and will be dealt with more fully. All right. America and the ancient world. I'm trying to tell you, this is what he's trying to tell you here. Many have already talked about this. Having in 1874, and sequence to other communications, read a paper before the Anthropological Institute in 1875. It was published in a distinct form as Researches in Prehistoric and Protohistoric Comparative Philology, Mythology. All right, that's the book we read, and that's the one I told you to check out. It's the playlist, this one right here. We read the whole book in 3 different videos, as you guys can see, the whole book. Make sure to go ahead and get that. Again, the researches in prehistoric and protohistoric comparative philology, mythology, and archaeology in connection with the origin of culture in America, okay? This treatise was especially devoted to the origin of culture in America and included a recapitulation of facts from various authorities and with additional observations of my own, largely linguistic, okay? We're talking about the origin of culture for humans, like in general, guys, the origin of culture in America. Culture, all right? Various tables show the identity of words and features of language in North America, Central America, South America, North Africa, West Africa, Australia, Asia, India, Caucasian, Europe. All right, they were able to match up the different languages who are connected by language, different parts of the world, different peoples. The interrelations of words in various regions was sufficiently shown, also the dependence of the American languages on those of other regions. 2 erroneous conclusions were, however, drawn by me and by then state of knowledge. First, that in agreement with accepted philology, languages were to be classified in families, and secondly, that the families were more or less precedent and could be chronologically arranged by development. The true solution is that all languages are of common origin, but of varied distribution, but this was not discovered by me for some years. Although my observations illustrated a general intercommunication of languages, there was such a general fear of accepting the Atlantic route of intercourse that my then leaning was to a Pacific route. This was more particularly influenced by a consideration for the supposed area of ancient culture. The supposed, that's why he was going with that side only, because that was where supposedly people were coming from, right? Asia. So he was kind of neglecting the Atlantic side and the influence of people traveling through the Atlantic back and forth and going. So he's going to get to that though, right? It is true this was extended by me through India to Indochina, thereby forming the connection with China, now becoming an accepted doctrine. The facts of the same class relating to Africa had not, however, been ascertained by me, though examination shows that the early extension of culture was uniform and reached to the shores of the Atlantic in the Old World. One table in the Prehistoric Comparative Philology was a comparison of river names in New Granada with those of India and Italy, right? You guys remember we read that in that book? Check out the videos if you missed them. And also of other South American river names, all right? It was the same. This was followed by a short list of mountain names. Of town names, a most copious enumeration was given, with of town names with similar comparative names from other regions. Sorry, I was reading the same sentence. This subject of topographical nomenclature has long engaged me, having been led to it by William von Humboldt. In examining the names of towns, it was impossible to avoid seeing, as so many had done, resemblances of form. On carrying out the investigations on a large scale, and with more labor, it appeared that the names are on one plan, and therefore one epoch, and are uniformly distributed. What disturbed me, as it had done others, was the necessity of accounting for the supposed influence of various populations, particularly of the Semitic population in Palestine. So that's the fake Holy Land, right? That's why they were confused, right? What disturbed them, because they were finding all that here, right? In various papers, these names in Palestine were proved to be identical with those in Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, and Spain. The clear evidence of Genesis is that the early population of Palestine was not Semitic, but Turanian. Uh-oh, I told you that's not the truth. And that makes more sense. And that early Turanian population is a lot of your West Africans and African, Central Africans today, guys. Remember the migrations where they were coming from. So they were not Semitic, but Turanian, Turan, right? That encompass all of like Persia and India, Turan at some point, right? And as we have lately found, allied to the populations of Kita, class in the regions already cited. Kita, the Katai. Ultimately, the same class of town names was largely traced by me in West and Central Africa. As the date of these names cannot yet be clearly defined, the comparative tables are formed on the ancient and the American names. One group of names cited by me as common to the two worlds is that given in Genesis as ancient cities. Okay, listen to this, but it may be of interest to give another quoted by Mr. Donnelly from Short's North Americans of Antiquity, page 497. The Armenian cities are taken from Ptolemy. Okay, listen, these are your Armenian cities. So where was Armenia in ancient times really? Watch what I'm tell you. So Armenian city, Chol, just like in Central America, you got Cholula, right? Where there's a large pyramid, where it's literally what Alexander von Humboldt said, a replica of the Tower of Babel, the way it's described in ancient texts, because they haven't found it on that side of the world yet. But the way it's described in ancient texts is the same way the pyramid of Cholula is built. Okay? We got a whole video on that. Then you got Colua. Then you got Coluacan in Central America. Coluacan. Come on, man. Armenian, you got Suivana. In Central America, you got Suivan. Suivana. Suivan. Suivana. Suivan. Then you got an Armenian word, Cholima. Then you got Central America, Colima. Cholima, Colima. Colima, Cholima. Cholima, Colima. Cholima. You got the Armenian, Salisa. Then you got Central American, Jalisco. Salisa, Jalisco. Salisa, Jalisco. All right, pretty close, but these words are very similar. So where was really Armenia in ancient times? When we're talking about biblical times, were they really talking about Armenia, the location today, or were they talking about always Central America? Look at how the words relate. This is what I'm trying to explain to you guys. They renamed places today to match their fake history, their fake geographical history. Okay? You've been seeing it in reverse. Some of these will be found in my list with wider illustrations as also examples of the conversion of SC and SH into SS. Okay? So he's saying it would sound the same the way they pronounced it. The application of these facts to the American continents was so direct that it led me to formulate the proposition that the establishment of culture and the settlement of towns in America was coeval with the same events in the Eastern Hemisphere. All right, almost at the same time, he's saying, and that the historical relations were of the same class. For convenience, the populations and languages were styled Kita and Kita Peruvian. Ha! And in 1877, the whole subject was reviewed at length by me in a paper before the Royal Historical Society, also separately published under the title of the Kita and Kita Peruvian Epic. All right, so that's this one right here, this book right here, guys, that he's talking about. All right, I already had found it. I'm like, we're about to get into the Kita, Kitai, Hittite, Hamath descendants again soon, so this might relate. It's getting deep. Yeah. Of that essay, this paper becomes a continuation and a correction. So this is like after, he wrote this is a little after, so he's like gonna make some corrections. It says much of this book, like the prehistoric comparative philology, was based on the publications beginning in 1863, describing my discoveries as to Asia Minor, 1863, the Kita inscriptions, 1871, and Palestine, 1879. The commencement was devoted to another form of proof of the connection of the populations being a dissection of the Hamath or Kita, the Katai, Kita, Kitai inscriptions. Among other results of interest may be named the relation of some of the Chinese characters as ideographs in conformity with their philological relations, since adopted by Empyreans, and also the connection of characters in Egyptian, cuneiform, and Chinese. The question of the Etruscan language, one connected with Atlantis, was dealt with on page 20 so as to show that the words belong to the general body of language, all right? Etruscan and Atlantis, right? So remember, they say Etruscans, very, very early type of kind of Roman people, but not really. There was Idumeans, there were Edomites, but these Etruscans, they're like Atlantic people who got Hellenized and Romanized too, ended up with them. But we got all their images, and there's, saying they might have come from Atlantis, just like the Basque and all these people. So here you go. From where? Atlantis, right? Where is Atlantis really? It is part of the Americas, right? The town named of the east of America were also in this book dealt with more in detail, and the linguistic tables will be found more fully given, and to them the reader of this paper is now referred for such evidence. Okay? It says here, relations of Central America and Africa. While hesitating as to the absolute assertion of the identity of culture and the two hemispheres, my knowledge of the whole subject was strengthened and corrected by a paper in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society for 1875 by a distinguished American man of science, Professor W.M. Gatt, who died shortly after. It was entitled The Indian Tribes and Languages of Costa Rica. All right? I probably got that book. I didn't even know it was connected to this, but we're going to see where the connection is here. And I'm going to get definitely into that when I do my videos, start doing my historic research on Costa Rica here, right? I'm talking about ancient Costa Rica. Okay, so he's quoting this guy, N.W. Gatt, in his book, The Indian Tribes and Languages of Costa Rica. So we're talking about, what are we talking about here, huh? Let's see what they're going to say. And dealt with tribes which had escaped the notice of my friends Chevalier de Chertsert and Mr. Tospelt. The languages are Bribri, Cabekar, Tiribi, and Terraba, and Branca, or Bruncas, right? Like these are all tribes from Costa Rica. I know these tribes. The whole population speaking them being 1,226. On comparing the vocabularies with those of the Old World, the words were readily traced and identified, in particularly with Africa. Now, see, it's funny because the people who represent all these tribes today is the same people. Some people would say, oh, these are Mongols. So what's their relationship with Africa, huh? In fact, it is in considering the relation of words and thoughts to culture that the results are to be understood. Sounds may perhaps, as supposed by many, be assigned independently and casually in various regions to represent ideas, but other considerations have to be taken into account when we find a large number of facts indicative of some common influence. The names of the following animals are capable of identification in these languages: tapir, an elephant; monkey, leopard and tiger or jaguar, right? Deer, bird, macaw, and parrot; snake, alligator, lizard, and iguana; frog, butterfly. Other words examined by me were arrow, bow, knife, calabash, pot, bed, door, house, cotton, leaf, tree, forest, rope, maize, drum, share, sand, skin, navel, smoke, coal, salt, rain, dew, day, night, God, devil. The same names for elephant extend from Central America to Japan, okay? We're talking about the indigenous languages. Listen, they have the same word for the animal elephant. Okay, from America to Japan. Listen, the animal names throughout the world are formed on identical basis. On these, my former explanations in the Prehistoric Comparative Philology, page 26, were incomplete and erroneous. Animal names are the same words and roots as applied to the nomenclature of other series. Thus, the name for an animal may be the same as that of a limb and a weapon. The main relation is that of numerical series and symbology, and this is the foundation of mythology, astrology, and ancient philosophy. There is an important citation by Dr. Tyler, Early History, page 312, from Humboldt, Vuedes Cordilleras, in which he regards the circumstance of the Mexicans having retained the traditions of the elephant as a myth of observation. Upon this, a comment was made by me in Prehistoric Comparative Philology, page 26. Subsequently, the matter came more closely under my observation in the Bribri, all right, this Costa Rican tribe, the Bribri, where the Old World elephant names in three forms are also preserved. All right, the Bribri still have the old way of saying elephant. In Guarani of Brazil, however, the name tapir is an Aga word for cow. It appears to me that the citation which struck the mind of Dr. Tyler is well worth attention because it refers to a familiar illustration and one which is more readily accepted by the public than a proof more decided, but less within their comprehension. For the name of the elephant to be introduced from Africa into America and given to its representative in the New World, there must have been intercourse in the epic of speech language in which was carried on across the Atlantic. Had there been the supposed bridge of Atlantis, then there would have been the same animals on both sides, tapirs in Africa and elephants in America. And this was not the case. But there was the record and tradition chronicled by Dr. Tyler, all right? So again, so some would say, like he's saying, oh, they might have been, they probably came from Africa and brought that, like, no, they might be seen in reverse. They didn't even have tapirs over there. And we had elephants, all, we had so many different types of elephants. The ancestor of all elephants, the bones are being found in the Americas all over the place. Okay? So we could have brought that over there as we went out from the true old world. And that bridge of Atlantis, yeah, there was more lands, but this is Atlantis. This is what I'm saying about dodging the hijack. We may dispose of the communication by the sunken continent and accept that by vessels across the wide ocean, carried in paths to and fro by the currents, it may be observed that we are not compelled to adopt all the supposed identifications of elephant forms and sculpture on the American continent. So they're saying maybe some people got caught up in the currents and came over here and they started, teaching the people about elephants, and that's why you find elephants on the buildings, in the Maya buildings, right? We've gone over this, right? They lived with the mastodons. Remember what they found in Mexico, Hueyatlalco. Evidence of humans living with elephants, and all over the North America as well. So we've already got past this part, all right? Now, when we're talking about currents and people getting trapped in them, what did we learn already, guys? The strongest current, the Gulf Stream, brings you to Europe, into Africa. It's actually easier to get caught in the current and go from America to that side of the world. It's 4 times harder to come back. We got more winds favorable and the currents are stronger going that way, guys. So we've already talked about all this. So all these theories of why there's elephants here, we've already debunked. A chief point in Professor Gabb's memoir was the description of the theological system of the Bribri, which provides one God, of whom the chief name is Sibu. Chief, like, right? This God appears to be symbolized throughout the universe, and Professor Gabb's description gives the true explanation of fetishism. The name of Sibu, Siva, or Saba, to be found frequently in mythology, and as a root, it is to be found with its congeners with many meanings throughout the African vocabularies. My paper was published under the name of Serpent and Siva, Worship and Mythology in Central America, Africa, and Asia, okay, by Trubner in 1876. Although there is much that is valuable in the language of North America, there are none which up to the present time have yielded so much as the Bribri, all right, a tribe from Costa Rica. Come on now. Of late, my attention has been drawn to another form of the title for the Supreme Being in the Old World and the New, and which appears to have become a matter of sectarianism. This, in its earliest shapes, appears as Wooden, Widen, Odin, Wutan, right? Wutan or Votan, and possibly as Buddha. In the present day, it is widely represented in Africa, but it is best known by the descriptions given of the Vadux or Voodoo mysteries by Sir Spencer St. John in his book on Haiti, and Mr. C.E. Leland in relation to the celebration of the mysteries in the United States. Mr. Leland is right in identifying the word as wooden, as I had already connected it with the names of God in Africa. Voodoo is also recognizable in Mexican history as Votan, Voodoo, Votan, Voodoo, Voodoo. The main basis of the rites of Cebu and Voodoo is the same as that of the Eleusinian and other ancient mysteries. The serpent is a common emblem. In some cases, as in Haiti, the rites degenerate into orgies accompanied with cannibalism. Whoa, that's the hijack. Does everybody that does voodoo do that? Oh man. Connected with these mysteries are secret meetings and initiations, degrees, ceremonies, signs, symbolic language, what is understood as Freemasonry. Freemasonry. And these are to be recognized not only in Africa, but also in Australasia. The information as yet obtained is very scanty, as the societies are maintained in secrecy. Africa is the great center for information with regard to the mysteries, as for other institutions. In the same year, 1875, a paper had been published by me on prehistoric names of weapons, which had been preceded by a note on the terms for arrow, read before the British Association in 1873. In this case, as in others, the evidence as to North and South America was decided, and it was detailed in parallel columns. In Prehistoric Comparative Philology from 1875 and page 32, all right, again, we read that whole book, catch the previous parts of this series right here. Some facts were brought forward by me as to the common distribution of names of tribes in various parts of the world. The basis for this fact was defined by me from the observed relation of the word man to the name of a tribe, of which there are so many instances, all right? So that's true. So, like, what he's trying to say is, like, let's say I'm just using an example. So we got the word Cherokee or the word Iroquois or the word whatever, and I'm just giving you an example. This may not be true, but he's trying to say that many of the tribal names actually goes to meaning the first man or man, human, I am man, the people, right? We the people, or man. So that's what he's talking about. So in many instances, you'll see that many of the tribes that he was noticing, it actually meant man, the name of their tribe literally just meant man in many instances. It does not, however, follow that two tribes of the same name have any ethnological connection, as the similarity of name is simply dependent on the original distribution of the words for man at the diffusion of speech language. The Reverend Professor John Campbell of Montreal, among many other labors and original researches illustrative of the connection of the Eastern and Western hemispheres, has paid particular attention to the distribution of these tribal and eponymous distinctions in the various regions in which they are found. Many of these observations of Professor Campbell are very remarkable, and indeed his various works, which have been published in Canada and elsewhere, are indispensable to the student of American ethnology. And we continue. This is part 3. It says Legend of Atlantis and the Four Worlds. The legend of Atlantis has occupied many, but yet has never perhaps received full consideration. It is to be found in the dialogues of Plato called Timaeus. One reason for the neglect of its practical part is that imagination has fastened on the part which is purely legendary, and which may be said to be purely superstitious. The account of the four worlds has been treated in the same way. What has been most readily seized hold of as to the Atlantis is that Plato states that Atlantis suddenly disappeared and sank beneath the sea. Then, identically as with the four worlds, the Atlantic Sea is said to be impassable and impenetrable, with this special concoction, as to Atlantis, that there was a quantity of mud in the way, the fact being the direct reverse. All right, so remember, there was a point in time where people like Plato and people in Europe couldn't cross the Atlantic. There was too much mud because of what had happened. So there was a separation for a long time, for a while. Okay, there was a barrier. A very valuable suggestion was lately made to me by the eminent scholar Mr. Cis Mijatovic, the minister of Serbia, member of the Academy of Belgrade. He points out that impediment created in some directions to navigators by the Sargasso Sea, Mar de Sargasso, or Sea of Weeds. As we know, the ancient penetrated to the Canary or Fortunate Islands, and vessels attempting another course and reaching the Sea of Weeds might well bring back the mud story. The navigators would naturally think that the weeds grew at the bottom of the sea, and consequently in mud, forming a serious impediment. This story got tacked on in due course to the tradition of Atlantis. That's what he's saying, right? It is most possible that the soundings of Columbus were first to know whether he was in a region of mud, and having ascertained that he was not, then he could accept the other version of an open ocean, which had indeed been confirmed by the discoveries in another direction of Vasco da Gama. Grote, in the third volume of his Plato, page 297 in the chapter 35, relating to Critias, gives an account of the island of Atlantis and its history, but without expressing any opinion. In the third volume of his History of Greece, however, to which he gives a reference in his 18th chapter on Phoenicians, he enters into question of the Atlantic Ocean being no longer navigable beyond a certain point, either from mud, sands, shallows, fogs, or accumulations of seaweed. Grote quotes Skylax, 109, who said that beyond Kern, the sea is no longer navigable from shallows and mud and seaweed. He also quotes the Timaeus and Critias of Plato. He further calls attention to the geographical productions in verse of Rufus Festus Avienus, Descriptio Orbis Terra, version or volume 57. In this latter passage, he speaks of large quantities of seaweed, and that's the Latin. The same statement again occurs in volume 115 and 130. Aristotle is referred to in Meteorology, volume 2, for the dead calm mud and shallows of the external ocean. Seneca is also adduced by Grote. Groth, who devotes much space to the subject, follows von Humboldt in the description of the terrors which beset the followers of Columbus and the passage of the Sea of Sargasso by that navigator. The effective reason for the cessation of the intercourse is that accepted that the great king of the West was defeated in the sea fight in the Mediterranean and his power utterly broken. Atlantis or look at this, Atalantis, right? Or Atitlan, Atitlantis, Lake Atitlan, where? In Guatemala. Atitlan, Atalantis, who's the Atalans? We're gonna get back into that. Remember, we read about the Atalans. I was just talking about Atlanteans or Americans. So Atlantis or Atalantis, they add the tis, the Greek, as we will be hereafter explained, appears to have been the title of the king rather than of his dominions. Okay? That was the title. Atalantis or Atalan was a title. The whole tale of the colonization of Atlantis is sufficiently curious. The generation of 5 pairs is a common legend of exogamous communities, and in Atlantis the eldest son also receives his mother's inheritance, a trait of mother right. If the details of the Timaeus are considered in a favorable rather than an unfavorable spirit, many things may be conciliated, for Plato did not invent matriarchy and exorgamous marriages, or such details of institutions dying out among the Hellenes, or the original so-called Greeks, which are Hellenized people, Hellenes. Elephants may be regarded as tapirs, horses as llamas. It is a circumstance worthy of note that just as the tapir names represent elephant names, so do llama, vicuña, and paca represent horse names of the old world. All right? You guys see? So what he's trying to tell you, that we're reading something about ancient Babylon, and they're talking about horses. They could be talking about llamas. Or if they're talking about elephants, they could be talking about tapirs. Or vice versa. That's what that's very important to understand. Or like they're saying llama or sheep. Llama give you wool, then you are a shepherd too, right? It is possible that on further investigation, we may find many points of verisimilitude. The great fact, however, remains that the intercourse across the Atlantic did take place, for language and other ideas at all events were transmitted from side to side. Of the many treatises on Atlantis, the last is by Mr. Ignatius Donnelly, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, all right? That's a book we've got into a lot, all right? And of course, we'll come back to it, which is in popular form. The author works out his theory on the basis of geological Atlantis suddenly disappearing. This does not account for the archaeological and the linguistic facts, many of which are adduced by the American author. The concurrent opinion of geologists is that the main forms and features of the Atlantic Ocean and of the American continent must have been given to them at a most ancient geological epoch, and not in any modern geological epoch, or in any epoch of which, by tradition or history, man has cognizance. The evidence on this head may be found in details in any authority treating of the subject. So far from a large continent or large mass of islands being depressed into the Atlantic Ocean, the facts are directly the reverse, and show that volcanic action, even in our times, has been throwing up islands from the bottom. Except the Bermudas, which are of coral origin, all the islands in the Atlantic are the result of volcanic eruption, not peculiar to any period, but continuing to our own day. In 1811, a new island was temporarily formed of St. Michael in the Azores, in the same way as takes place in the Mediterranean and other seas. A few years after another formation was thrown up, all these operations are on a small scale and in few cases present permanent results. In fact, while changes are constantly proceeding, they are not of character to alter the main features or provide for the creation of an Atlantis or its destruction. In an able review of Atlantis in the St. James Gazette of June 20, 1882, it was pointed out that the geological theory had long ago been exploded. It was demolished by Mr. Darwin and his chapter on oceanic islands. All right, Darwin. And the same fate was destined for it by Mr. A.R. Wallace in his volume on island life. There is no evidence that such a continent ever did exist, nor is it even possible that it could. No fossil or living remains of indigenous mammals or terrestrial vertebrates of any kind are to be found. The fauna and flora of the islands are strictly oceanic. Dr. Andrew of Leipzig is of opinion that iron was not known in America other than meteoric iron in pre-Columbian times. And that's false. We've already proven. I got a video on this. We were making iron here. There was iron smelting sites that they have found. He dwells chiefly on the absence of iron in graves of Peru and Chile, and considers that the great monuments were erected either with bronze, chumpi, or stone tools. He allows that the Americans knew how to work gold, silver, tin, copper, and quicksilver, but things they could not forge iron. All right, he thinks. All right, but they did. He says they had a word, panilgue, for iron, but this he considers meant metals in general. Iron tools are not generally found anywhere, but they are asserted to have been discovered in North American mounds. See? In the mounds, I told you guys, we got the videos on this, and we have to wait for further discoveries. Mr. St. John Vide of Edinburgh wrote some years ago a book on the antiquity of iron working, in which he entered very fully into the matter. On a new edition of this, he is now engaged, having accumulated more information. The same statement was long since put forth by myself, particularly in reference to the Chalybes and metalworking tribes of Asia Minor. Dr. Percy, in his address as president at the Iron and Steel Institute, renewed the opinions he had formerly given to a like effect. The Marquis de Nadialak, a gentleman who has given much attention to Central America, has this year published a book on the prehistoric intercourse between Europe and America. With numerous illustrations, like Mr. Donnelly, he is full believer that this intercourse took place and that the numerous resemblances and coincidence can only by a physical connection be so explained. He looks rather to prehistoric intercourse and the passage of cavemen like those of the Dogmini to America. He or his translator has completely excluded all reference to the Atlantis. All right, so this other guy, which we're probably going to read his book at one point, sounds interesting, right? He's again seen in reverse. He says there's so many similarities. They have to be connected. They have to have met. Well, this is the old world. That's why they're similar. You're talking about a copy. You're talking about duplicates and copies. That's the thing. They've always been talking about duplicates and copies. Talking about their similarities. Yeah, this is the original. This compilation will be found useful to inquirers, more particularly for the illustrations, although these are chiefly on too small a scale to admit of detailed study. M.D. Nadialak has made no real progress in decipherment and appears to devote too much attention to French descriptions. It may conveniently be mentioned in this place that Professor Flower, the late president of the Anthropological Institute, has recently expressed his opinion on the Eskimo question in a discussion on Laplanders at the Institute on June 9, 1885. The opinions of Professor Flower with regard to the older systems of craniology are very much modified, and he is remodeling the whole science. On reviewing the forms of skulls of the Eskimos in Asia and America, he considered it inadmissible in the present state of evidence that the Eskimos can have gone from Europe to Greenland, but that they proceeded from Asia eastward. Long and short skulls he considers to be no longer specific distinctions in the present racial characteristics of the Eskimos he treats as having been modified by the populations through which they passed in their migrations from Central to Northern Asia. All right, so again, that's all their theories. They might even be seeing the Eskimos in reverse, coming out of here, or even the Arctic, the middle, the Arctic, its own, a whole other history there, ancient history, is there more lands, all that. Besides these books, Mr. Donnelly and the Marquise did not dialogue. There was in the number of the Literary Journal of New York for August 1884 a bibliography by Mr. Paul Baron Watson of the Pre-Columbian discoveries of America. All right, we might get into his little writing here. His first class was the Chinese, 499 AD, Northmen, 1000 to 1347, Arabs, circa 1125, Welsh, 1170, Venetians. So this is what he's saying is that this guy said that all these people came here. So the Chinese came in 499, right? Northmen in 1000 to 1347, you know, all that. So everybody came, nobody left here, right? Everybody always had to come. Yeah, there was trade coming back and forth since ancient times, guys. Of course, they were coming to the motherland and the land of the terrestrial paradise where there was resources from everything. Of course, these people would come and trade and do business with some maybe of their ancient ancestors, you know. But either way, this is what the guy is saying. This guy he's saying, Mr. Paul Baron Watson. He's listing all these people coming here. Again, the Venetians, 1380, Portuguese, 1463 for Columbus. I definitely believe that. Columbus is Portuguese. He knew. Poles, 1476. Okay. Martin Benheim, 1483. All these people came. Cousin of Dieppe, 1488. It will be seen that the materials dealt with in this essay are not embraced by Mr. Watson. Students must be cautioned that the argument does not rest on the narrative of authority of Plato as to Atlantis, as is assumed by some persons. The doctrine of the four worlds, and Atlantis as one of them, was, as is here shown, dealt with by many writers of antiquity. Okay, Atlantis one of them, and we know that when it comes to the four worlds, they meant America as the four. So now he's saying, which is literally Atlantis, right? That they meant Atlantis is literally America. But it so happens that Plato deals at great length with Atlantis, and he does not touch on the greater question. Plato, we have to consider on account of the extent to which he supplies material, but not as the chief of the sole authority. The writer of the article Atlantis, Atalantis, or Atlantica, in the third volume, page 27 of the Encyclopedia Britannica. See if we can get our hands on that, right? That sounds like a great article, which is now in course of publication, gives an abstract from Plato with his own comments, which wells some of the popular view among scholars. Such is the main substance of the principal account of the island furnished by the ancients, an account which, if not entirely fictitious, belongs to the most nebulous period of history. The story may embody some popular legend, and the legend may have settled on certain historical circumstances. But what these were, it is, as the numerous theories advanced on the subject may be held as proven impossible now to determine. All right, so at least he's admitting it has probably based on some certain historical circumstances. Yeah, it's in America, you know. This is a judgment which may be admitted as orthodox, but at the same time it involves many fallacies, not the least of which is to be found at the close. The fact that a number of persons, having been unable to solve a problem, have arrived at contradictory opinions represents a fact, but one which has nothing to do with the matter. Until a solution is found, there may be contradiction of opinions, but such does not prove whether the problem is soluble or insoluble. It does not prove that because numerous persons have been incompetent to propose a solution may not come from a competent person. The attempt at solution is legitimate, and yearly some dark point in historical investigation is cleared up, whereby contradictory opinions are brought to a close. The function of Gibbon, of Grote, of Niebuhr, and of other great authorities has been to destroy what has been received as history where it is unsound, to examine the popular legend, and determine in what degree it rests on historical circumstances. Okay, we're talking about Atlantis, historical circumstances, and to show the true bearing of those historical circumstances when divested of the causes of doubt and error. If error propagates error, so does any element of truth become the means of developing and establishing some other truth and of destroying some error. Right? He says here, part 4, Atlantis and the Timaeus. In the Timaeus of Plato, we find the first reference of that author of the history of Atlantis. It is given by him as a distinct tradition handed down from Solon, to whom he was related. This dialogue and the Critias may be consulted in any translation, or more conveniently, in Atlantis by Ignatius Donnelly, all right, which we have read. In the Timaeus, Critias relates that Solon had brought with him a history from Egypt, all right, ancient Egypt, right? Solon had a contest with an Egyptian priest at Sais as to the ancient annals of Athens, and the priest had told him that the real annals of Athens were more illustrious than he, Solon, supposed. They embraced an action, the greatest and most celebrated which this state ever achieved. Solon, you are unacquainted with that noble and excellent race of men who once inhabited your country, from whom you and your whole present state are descended. Though only a small remnant of this admirable people is now remaining, your ignorance in this matter resulting from the fact that their posterity for many generations died without the power of speech through the medium of letters. For long before the chief deluge of a city of Athenians existed, regulated by the best laws both in military and all other matters, whose noble deeds and civil institutions are said to have been the most excellent of all we have heard to exist under heaven. It may be taken that this refers to the previous Iberian, Khetoid or pre-Hellenic epoch, when Athens, as well as the other cities of the ancient world, was founded and received its names. All right, was these locations really somewhere else? Closer to home? Huh. In Egypt, these matters would be better understood than in Athens. In Athens, the old languages had died out and the ancient literature was extinct. And herein it greatly differed from Rome, which, like Babylon and Nineveh, remained under the spell of Turanian religion and science. Etruscan maintaining its vitality there, as Akkad did in the last. Etruria remained for ages a compact state and nationality, long after the Aryan military adventurer had got possession of Rome. But there was nothing of this kind in the neighborhood of Athens in the time of Plato, though in Asia there was an example in the great kingdom of Lydia, and down to a late age many populations were barbarous speaking. In the Hellenic peninsula, the Hellenes cleared out the tribes, and their language spread into Epirus, Macedonia, and Thrace, so that though Athens received immigrants from those countries, as now the Hellenic dialect, written and spoken, held the preponderance. Hellenic dialect, not a nation though. Remember who these different groups of so-called Greeks who's founding all these towns like Athens and stuff, remember, a lot of them were Israelites. In Egypt, the resort not only of the Hellenes, but of the mercenaries from Western Asia, the Iberian relationships were better understood, and the more particularly as the Egyptians had held possessions in Syria. We must, however, take the teachings of the Egyptian priests as indicating not Athens. Solely through Athens was evidently in the Iberian epoch a great city, but rather the Iberian races and states and the empire of the great king of the East. The priest, among other things, states that, with respect to wisdom, you may perceive what attention the law paid to it, even from the first, as likewise to all that respects the universe, including even divinations and medicine, that conduces to preservation of health, and from these which are divine things, the inquiry proceeds to human affairs and all other branches of learning therewith connected. This is a very truthful picture of the protohistoric epoch of culture from which the Egyptian, so-called Egyptian, all right, the Assyrian and the Hellenic proceeded. They came from what? A protohistoric culture, and his other books, which we read if you watch the playlist, right? The origin of culture in America, the connection of culture in America, right? The origin of culture in America. Many and mighty deeds of your state then are here recorded in writing and call forth our admiration. Nevertheless, there is one in particular which in magnitude and value surpasses them all, for these writings relate what a prodigious force your city once overcame, when a mighty warlike power rushing from the Atlantic Sea spread itself with hostile fury over all European Asia. Okay? The Americans invaded. They're just telling a story of people going there and colonizing, right? Who were these Americans? Were they Mayas, Incas? I mean, not Incas, but South American people, Brazilian people, right? From Central America, from North America, mound builders, right? Could be many people. In applying this passage, we must not understand it as meaning that the force was derived solely from outside the Mediterranean, for we find that the Atlantic power held the western countries of Europe and Africa, a circumstance which was probably not without its influence in closing the Mediterranean. Ultimately, to the Atlantic king was the Semitic migration. This migration did not affect Hellas or Italia, but it did Cyprus, Carthage, and Spain. Hellas and Italia became the seat of the Aryan rivalries and offered less temptations to the Phoenician and Punic pirates. All right, so Aryan means noble, all right, noble rivalries. Phoenician seafarers to the temptations to the seafaring and Punic pirates. Then did Hispania, divided like all Iberian countries into petty principalities of mixed populations. The cohesion of these again must have been affected by the fall of the Atlantic king and the loss of his dominions. Similar conditions influenced Gaul and the Britons. They fell a prey to the Celtic invasions, and though some of the states of Iberian origin lingered on their power and wealth, declined. All right, what happened? Britons, right? What we read yesterday about the Welsh, Iberian origin, swarthy people, so-called black people, were there first. Plato goes on to say that the Atlantic Sea was then navigable, an observation to be kept in mind, and that it had an island fronting the strait. This island, he says, was larger than Libya and Asia put together, a description well beseeming America. Okay, larger than Libya and Asia, not a little place in Mauritania. Okay, you guys gotta understand. By Libya, he means all of North Africa, and by Asia, he means all of Asia and Europe. So bigger than all those lands combined right there. Yeah, America fits the description. Okay. Further, he says distinctly, there was a passage hence for travelers of that day to rest of the islands, as well as from all those islands to the whole opposite continent that surrounds the real sea, talking about the Pacific. For as respect what is within the mouth here mentioned, it appears to be a bay with a kind of narrow entrance, and that sea is indeed a true sea, and the land that entirely surrounds it may really and truly be called a continent. All right, the Americas. This is a correct description, but the real point for note is the acknowledgement that there had been in ancient times a free navigation. In this Atlantic island, continued Plato, was formed a powerful league of kings who subdued the entire island, together with many others in parts also of the continent, besides which they subjected to their rule the inland parts of Libya as far as Egypt and Europe, also as far as Tyrrhenia. My comment on this is that the head seat of the great king was possibly in the Caribbean Sea. Listen to what he's telling you. Where was the seat or the center of the great king? The great king in the Caribbean Sea. It may be in Saint Domingo. He's talking about Hispaniola. It is to be noted, however, that at the Spanish invasion, this island was under the Caribs, whose language is traced there, all right? Caribs, Carians. Huh? Yeah, then the Carians just show up in Asia Minor. Consequently, the relics of the former civilization in this and the other islands was lost. Dodge the hijack. What is further to be found in America of the ancient occupation time alone can show. At that ancient epoch, the great kingdoms of Mexico, of the Mayas, of the Chibchas, of Peru must already have existed. Okay? They were already in there when they talk about in Plato's time, in Atlantis' time. It may be that the voyage of Columbus was on the ancient route. A material statement of Plato, and one more probably within safe traditions than the rest, was that which assigned to the dominions of the great king parts of Africa, which would include the coast and of Europe, which embraced Hispania and most probably Gaul and Britain. Well, when they mean Hispania, they literally mean the Iberian Peninsula. The whole of this forest being collected, states Plato, and a powerful league undertook at one blow to overawe your country, Europe, and ours, Egypt, and all the land besides that lies within the mouth. By comparison with the other passage, this involves some indistinctness, as it is already stated that the great king of the West held dominion up to Tyrrhenia. This was the period so long when the power of your state was universally celebrated for its virtue and strength, far surpassing all others both in magnanimity and military skills, sometimes taking the lead of the Greek nation, at others left to itself by the defection of the rest and brought into the most extreme danger. It still prevailed, raised the trophy over its assailants, kept from slavery those not as yet enslaved, ensured likewise the most powerful liberty for all of us, without exception, who live within the pillars of Hercules. The continuation of events is thus related. Subsequently, however, through violent earthquakes and deluges which brought desolation in a single day and night, the whole of your warlike race was at once merged under the earth, and the Atlantic island itself was plunged beneath the sea and entirely disappeared, whence even now that sea is neither navigable nor to be traced out, being blocked out by the great depth of mud, which by soothing island produced. All right, and that's so, a little the story of, from the Greek, so-called Greeks and their version of it, right? Turned a little into mythology and all that. It says here, part 5, the description in the Critias. We may leave the discussion of these theories and proceed to the dialogue of Plato. Critias, which is the real continuation of Timaeus, but of which the text has come down to us in an imperfect state. Indeed, Mr. Grote, in the 3rd volume of his Plato's chapter on Critias, is doubtful whether Plato finished or meant to finish this dialogue. All right, they saying he probably didn't even write it, basically, or what's going on? Who are these so-called Greeks? Is this really in ancient times, or we're talking about the Middle Ages, right? Remember all the history and research we've done about the false chronology and about Roman ancient Greek, right? So-called. That part that concerns us begins, and it says here in the Critias, right? First of all, then let us recollect that it is about 9,000 years since war was proclaimed between those dwelling outside the pillars of Hercules, towards the Atlantic, right? They mean between Spain and Morocco, right? Past that, right? And all those within them, which war we must now describe. On the latter party, then, this city, Athens, was the leader and conducted the whole war, and of the former, the kings of the Atlantic island, which we said in the Timaeus was once larger than Libya and Asia, but now sunk by earthquakes, a mass of impervious mud, which hinders all those sailing in the vast sea from effective a passage hither, and thus our story will, as it were, unfold to your view the many barbarous tribes and such of the Greek nations as then existed, as each may happen to present itself. The dialogue then proceeds to give a mythical history of the ancient Athenians. Critias says expressly that Solon turned the native names of the Atlantis into their Greek meanings, and he thus accounts for the appearance of such words. This is in favor of the statement having really been adopted from abroad. As we remark, says Critias, at first commencing the allotment of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth, all right, allotment of the gods, right, just like Noah and his sons getting each lot, right? So who's these so-called gods? And where they really, all these deities really coming from, remember? They have to do with either American real people, ancient Americans, or geographical locations in America. These mythical stories of the so-called Greeks. So it says here, Critias at first commencing the allotment of the gods that they distributed the whole earth here into larger and smaller portions. So Poseidon, in particular, taken as his lot the Atlantic island, begot children by a mortal woman, and settled in some such spot of the island as we are about to describe. We next get an account of Poseidon becoming enamored of the daughter of 2 aborigines. So there was other people, right? So these gods, all right, they get in lots, but there's already aborigines there, listen, which is one of the peculiarities of the narrative, because we are led to believe that the real population of the earth was from Poseidon. See? That's what I was just saying. So I thought they were the first people. So what do you mean he got with the daughter of two aborigines? Who are these aborigines? Listen, it may be a vague admission of an aboriginal population, which was brought under the culture by the invading Iberians. Poseidon is said to have created two springs, one hot and one cold, which may become an identification of a site, and five pairs of male twins to whom he gave kingdoms. The eldest is stated to have been named Atlas. All these and their descendants dwelled for many generations and ruled in the Sea of Islands, yet further extended their empire as before said to Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Whether, however, this passage means that the king of the west held Egypt and Tyrrhenia may be doubted, and the historical meaning may be inferred to be that he held the countries next Tyrrhenia and Egypt. So continuing with the story. By far the most distinguished were the sons of Atlas, and among them the eldest king in succession always handed down his power to his eldest son, all of them successively possessing wealth in such abundance as never was before found among royal dynasties, nor will easily be found hereafter. And all things were provided for them, which in a city or elsewhere are worth such provision. Many possessions indeed accrued to them through their power from foreign countries, but the greatest part of what they stood in need of was supplied by the island itself. First, such ores as are dug out of mines in a solid state, or require smelting, and especially that metal aurichalcus, which is now known only by name, but formerly of high celebrity, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being considered the most valuable of all the metals then known except gold, and it produced an abundance of wood for builders and furnished food also for tame and wild animals. All right, basically they're describing, that's the ancient Greeks describing Atlantis, right? This is in the Critias again, and that literally describes America. That's how resourceful America is. All right, all that you can picture America, especially before Europeans arrived, colonized and cut everything down and destroying things little by little. That's what it literally describing. This probably refers to the supply of precious metals, for which see also Aelian. Remember, that was related to the Americas, the Aelian, of which the king of the West would have the monopoly to himself. Then comes a passage which has hitherto sealed the fate of the authenticity of the tradition and caused it to be set down as fable, but which may be evidence of the contrary. Moreover, they were comprised within vast numbers of elephants. These are interpreted by me as tapirs, for there were abundant means of support for all animals that feed in marshes and lakes, on mountains and plains, all right? But literally, guys, they could have literally meant elephants. Ancient America had elephants. The productiveness is further referred to in rhetorical detail. Fruits, vegetables, drinks, meats, and ointments, all right? All that. And that's America. There were said to be certain dainty fruits for dessert that might provoke the satiated palate or please the sick. Critias describes how the inhabitants employed themselves in erecting temples, royal habitations, ports, and docks over the whole region. And of similar works there are remains enough in America. Like I'm saying, that's literally describing America. Of the royal city and palace, Critias enters into a lengthened description. He represents that gold and silver were largely used in the decorations. Warm baths are specified in separate baths for women. The most troublesome passage speaks of an arena for horses. An arena for horses. Listen, of course we had horses here, guys. This is the Americas. And also of riding horses for soldiers. There is a possibility that the details as to the establishment of war chariots may belong to the European and not to the American dominions of the great king. And in such case, a connection may be suggested between such war chariots and those encountered by Julius Caesar in Britannia. Why wouldn't we have war chariots? We had the wheel here. They found the wheel. They found Maya toys and all that with wheels. Of their polity, An express condition was said to be that none of the 10 states were to engage in war with each other, and that they were to combine against any city breaking out in sedition or trying to destroy the royal race. 10 states, huh? 10 tribes, huh? 10 lost tribes separated from the other two? They had held from immemorial custom a common assembly as to the right course both in war and other concerns, and assigning the empire to the Atlantic race. They did not allow the king, however, any authority to put to death any of his kinsmen unless approved by more than half of the 10. The writer, while engaged in suggesting that a diminution of public virtue was the cause of the fall of the state, can no longer be followed, as the continuation of the dialogue is missing, and no manuscript has yet been found under the circumstances stated. All right, and we continue, and we are in part 6, and it says here, other traditions. The mythological fables connected with Atlas and the Atlantides or Pleiades possibly refer to the traditions recorded by Plato. All right, so again, Pleiades, Atlantis, all that's related to the Americas, right? We've done so much corroboration with that research, in past videos. Thus, Atlas is treated as among the earliest men and leaders, being son of Japetus and brother of Prometheus. As some say, he was a son of Asia, daughter of Oceanus. All right, that's the mythical part, but it all represents something. Remember, Oceanus, Prometheus, all that. Atlas was all related to ancient America. We've broken this down. And the division of the world, he received the western portion, including Mauritania. Hesperus was a son of Atlas and represented the west and the islands of the Hesperides. I told you these are the true Hesperides over here. The several islands were symbolized as the Pleiades. He is also represented as possessing Italy, which according to the account in Plato appears to have been included in the domains of the Atalantis. All right, so we had colonies, basically. Atlantis had colonies out in Italy and all these other places. They're saying Mauritania, right? Just colonies. That wasn't the center, right? So they had domains, these Atalantis. Hesiod places the Hesperides at the western extremity of the earth. Okay, the Hesperides, America. The continent of Atalantis, according to Plato, abounded in gold. Again, and I'm going to show you guys, I got a plan to do a very researched gold, the history of gold, the indigenous gold right here in the Americas, and a couple videos on that, probably have a series on that, so you guys can see when we're talking about an abundance of gold, where that really is a true gold coast, that's here in the Americas, right? So again, Plato describes the Atalantis, Atalan, abounded in gold. And the chief feature in the legend of the Hesperides is the tree that produces golden apples. Is that literally lemons, or is that pineapples? That's said to be a fruit or a vegetable, right? Mythology, like the story in Plato, represents contests between the East and West, Libya and Atalantis. Libya is North Africa versus America. Busiris, king of Egypt, carried off the Hesperides, but they were recovered by Hercules. On the other hand, a Hercules invaded the Hesperides and carried off the gold. Orion also attacked the Atlantides. Mr. Ignatius Donnelly, in his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, right, this book we've read a lot, has collected a mass of passages on the subject, though he treats them as confirmatory of his theory of a submerged land. An extract is stated by him to be preserved in Proclus, taken from a work now lost, and which mentions islands in the exterior sea, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It was known that in one of these islands the inhabitants preserved from their ancestors a remembrance of Atlantis, an extremely large island which for a long time held dominion over all islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, just talking about the Americas. This is, in my opinion, a reference to one of the Canary or Fortunate Islands, and to be taken as an evidence. Aelian, Mr. Donnelly cites in his Varia Historia, related the particulars of an interview between Midas, king of Phrygia, and Silenus, in which Silenus reported the existence of a great continent beyond the Atlantic, larger than Asia, Europe, and Libya put together. All right, so is Mauritania bigger than all these continents put together? No, right? Mauritania is actually inside of Libya or North Africa. So it couldn't be Mauritania. We couldn't be talking about a small little place, guys. We're talking about a whole big continent, bigger than 3 continents. That's the Americas. All right, that's the Americas, including with all the land that sunk, right? Imagine, it was huge. He stated that a race of men called Meropes, Meropes, dwelt there and had extensive cities. They were persuaded that their country always was a continent, and in it gold and silver were so plentiful that they were esteemed no more than iron in Asia. Out of curiosity, some of them crossed the ocean and visited the Hyperboreans. This, again, is of interest, as it shows the Asiatic chain of tradition, and is to be taken in concurrence with the teaching of the doctrine in the school of Pergamos. As to Silenus and Midas, they are only Greek phrases to express a tradition of the pre-Hellenic period before they got Hellenized, Hermetized, Hermetics. The regions wherein the tradition would be preserved would be Britain, Gaul, Spain, Etruria, the Canaries, Mauritania, Egypt, Asia. That's where it was preserved. That's not where it was. The old Greeks and Romans had no intercourse with the Britons, and afterwards the invasion of the Celts broke the chain of Iberian knowledge, unless the teaching of the monk Vergilius is to be taken as in point. Before the Celts, the Phoenicians had done the same in Gaul. In Hispania, we trace the historical influence as in Mauritania. So again, Hispania means Iberian Peninsula in this book right now. The Aryan Romans learned little from the Etruscans before the national decadence of the latter. Hellas early fell under the power of Aryans. In the Canaries, we find the legend was preserved. Proclus in Ireland, Vergilius in Italy, Cicero in Egypt, Plato, and in Asia, Aelian. Now, all these localities in the Greek and Roman period were separated and gave no combined evidence. Another passage, Mr. Donnelly, page 28, quotes Diodorus Siculus for the statement that the Phoenicians discovered a large island in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, several days' sail from the coast of Africa. This island abounded in all manners of riches. The soil was exceedingly fertile. The scenery was diversified by rivers, mountains, and forests. It was a custom of the inhabitants to retire during the summer to magnificent country houses, which stood in the midst of beautiful gardens. Fish and game were found in great abundance. The climate was delicious, and the trees bore fruit at all seasons of the year. Wow, that sounds like literally a description of Costa Rica, but that could be many parts of the Americas, right? But you see, Mr. Ignatius Donnelly was kind of seeing everything in reverse when we read his book. He literally is saying it was just an island separated from the Americas, nothing to do with the Americas, but we know it was connected to the Americas. You know, it was a whole empire, a whole, big, right? Remember, bigger than Libya, Europe, and Asia. This may represent the result of the voyage of some Carthaginian ship driven over the ocean, and which got back as best it could, but it does not represent the outcome of regular Phoenician or Carthaginian intercourse. All right, so again, the Phoenicians coming out of the true Holy Land here, Phoenicians are from here. They're seen in reverse. Carthaginians possibly too, guys. We had our own Carthage here, like ancient Carthage, like literally Cartagena, Cartago, all those words mean Carthage in Spanish. We have those here, and they had empires in these places. Cicero and the Somnium Scipionis refers to habitable continents. Macrobius is commenting on the Somnium Scipionis, chapters 2, 5, and 9, discusses the question of there being 4 great islands, 2 in the north and 2 in the south hemisphere. Von Humboldt dealt with this statement and, like myself, considers it to represent the regions of the world. He too considered, as I am now, fully convinced that Columbus was influenced by this reasoning in his search, all right? Columbus knew Atlantis was the Americas, all right? You hear this? I've been trying to tell you. You got a source for that. In fact, one problem Columbus had to solve was whether it was true, as alleged in Plato, that the Atlantic Ocean was blocked with mud. When he had ascertained that it was not so, he was in a position to look out for his two continents. He may have thought it possible, as stated in the tradition, that the two continents were separated at the equator and that he would find an open channel to Cathay. That's what he thought, that he can go through Central America. But he didn't find the canal. There was a canal in his time, guys. At the time when Columbus, as well as others, were discussing the subject of new lands to be discovered, literary resources had become available. The Latin writers could be examined, but above all, the fall of Constantinople had driven numbers of Greeks into Italy. The Greek language was studied, and Greek books were eagerly bought by the Latin nations as before they had been by the Arabs. Thus all that had been written as to the four worlds was within the ken of Columbus. One part of the investigation of the subject turns on the tradition of antiquity recorded by Plato, as to the sun, moon, and stars having once risen in the opposite quarter to what they now do. Mr. Halliburton considers this to be a reference to the knowledge of the ancients that the rising south of the equator had actually been seen and communicated. To the Tahitians, the sun, moon, and stars rise on their right hand, as to us on the left. There are traditions as to a lost world, which may have reference to the cessation of correspondence with America. One existing to this day among the Slavonic nations mentioned by Mr. Mijatovic is to the effect that there was once another world lost by conflagration. So was the world of Plato, lost by volcanic influences, from which account the Slavonic tale may have emanated. For the later period of knowledge, as to the four worlds may be mentioned St. Clement, who said in his epistle to the Corinthians that there were other worlds beyond the ocean. The Irish priest Virgilius in the 8th century taught in Germany that the earth is a globe, that there are antipodes, and that there may be population there. Saint Boniface, the English apostle, having complained against this, Pope Zachary declared it to be perversa et iniqua doctrina, contrary to the law of God. It is possible that on careful comparison of Irish and Gaelic legends, many traces of the former epic would be found in a traditional shape. Mr. Hector MacLean of Islay, who has devoted much research to the subject of the early legends, has of late had his attention called to probable Iberian survivals. He informs me that in many of the folk tales of illiterate peasants, Rye and Domhill, king of the world, is a common expression, as well as in the Highlands, as in Ireland. In these tales, heroes are lauded who fought with the king of the world and defeated him. There is also frequent mention made of Eileen Fomalhac and Dumhain, the island on the border of the world, or in the farthest part of the world, okay? So all these legends referring to ancient America, basically, guys. With regard to a disputed phrase, Sitir Rana Ruat an Domhain, Mr. MacLean is inclined to suggest that it may mean lordship of the world. As Innisfail, one of the names of Ireland, may mean King's Island, Mr. MacLean regards this as a possible attribute of the last portion of the Iberian kings of the West. All right, the Iberian kings of the West, huh? Who colonized Iberia is what I'm trying to tell you. It wasn't from Africa. With regards to the description of the possessions of the Atalantis, it comes in great conformity with what must have been the necessities of the great king for the occupation of America, and an explanation of what must have been the causes of cessation of intercourse on account of the physical constitution of the Atlantic and the course of its winds and currents. It was necessary to have a foothold not only on the shores of America, but on the shores of this side of the Atlantic. This is another independent circumstance in favor of the general narrative of Plato, for he shows his ignorance of the real conditions. His account provides for the occupation of the west shore of Africa and of Hispania, and it must be assumed as a consequence of the Britannic islands and possibly the shores of Gaul. In the time of Julius Caesar, Aquitania was Iberian. but the coins show us that the other parts of Gaul had been colonized and occupied by the Iberians, and by argument goes to the extent that the Belgians were to be regarded as Iberian, the Belgians, huh? So remember, when it comes to saying, hey, Iberian origin, Iberian this, Iberian, hey, they like to say that all the so-called black people in Europe were, oh, that's because they were Iberian. Oh, they got some Negro in them because they're Iberian, huh? Belgians are Iberian, huh? In the time of Caesar, the Celtic races had become predominant in Gaul, and the Britons had invaded Hispania and Belgium. This historical state we must take as an indication for our guidance. After the decline of the great king, the navigators who attempted to follow him to his vassal provinces would have no claim to a friendly reception, and step by step the Iberian vassal kings and chiefs would fall into dissensions with each other and become a prey to the Celts. The Celts, like the Hellenes, had no traditions of Western intercourse to preserve. The Atlantic Ocean has in particular trade winds from east to west within 30 degrees latitude north and south, not is to be noted from west to east, under which had America been first occupied across the Pacific from China, as assumed, it might be supposed the population there would have instituted intercourse across the Atlantic with the eastern world. All right, what he's saying right here, guys, is that the winds and the currents is easier to go from America to that side of the world, crossing the Atlantic. Like, we already know that. He's literally telling us the same thing here, just in another way. He said, if it was that they were populated first, if America was populated first, then they would have instituted intercourse across the Atlantic with the Eastern world. And guess what? It was populated first. So they did do that. We've already broken this down. A lot of the ancient people of Western Europe are literally ancient Americans that had colonized there, had ended up there. Okay? Indeed, so favorable are the winds, again, and this is from a whole other person. We got this job already from the historian of navigation, the most famous historian of navigation, right? He studies that. He was an expert in that. He told us that it was easier to go from America to that side. It's 4 times harder coming the other way around. The currents are a lot stronger and the winds are more favorable. Now, here we go again. We're getting from somebody else, right? Indeed, so favorable are the winds that Humboldt thought it less dangerous to pass from the Canaries to America than to traverse one of the small lakes of Switzerland. The Spaniards, he says, called this part of the Atlantic El Golfo de las Damas, or the Ladies' Sea, as the passage to America could safely be effected in an open boat. This opinion is the more noteworthy as it meets the doubts raised by those who believe that modern decked ships can alone make the passage. Such vessels as the most ancient navigators possessed could well accomplish the purpose, and it is hardly necessary to cite that was done by the early navigators as recorded by Hadliuk, or how often we have known adventurous men in our days make the contrary and dangerous passage of the North Atlantic in open boats. All right, so a lot of people have proved this, that they can cross the Atlantic Pacific with very primitive indigenous type boats. So especially when you're riding the currents and the winds, like when you know that. It is noticeable that though there is an equatorial current passing from the Canary south of the Sargasso Sea to Guyana and the West Indies, there is another and the main equatorial current, the main, much more favorable, passing from the Gulf of Guinea to South America. It is on the shores of the Gulf of Guinea that language are to be found having affinity with those of Central America. So this is a little bit a hijack here because he's starting the current right there when that current that he's talking about actually starts in the Caribbean. Yeah, he's talking about the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream goes all up the East Coast, down into Europe, down into where he's saying, that's where he's picking it up, right? The Gulf of Guinea and back into South America and then goes back around. Yeah, but it starts and it's more stronger in the Caribbean, its origin, okay? So if you're in Jamaica, you get cut in this current, you get brought all the way to Ireland or even down into the Iberian Peninsula and then even into the Gulf of Guinea, right? This is where he's starting it though. He's being biased here. And again, remember earlier he was saying, trying to make the Bribri Indians Africans. He's trying to say the language, but he's seen it in reverse. This is what I'm saying. He's saying the right things, but he's saying it in reverse. It is on the shores of the Gulf of Guinea that languages are to be found having affinity with those of Central America. Though in so many ages, great displacements and new developments may have occurred. On the other hand, the local races may have always compressed on the shores of the ocean. The point at which the Guinea current is available is that of which the geographical knowledge of the ancient writers held cognizance. All right. So it says here, part 7, effect on the revolution on East and West. The fall of the Western Iberians, Americans, must have been attended with great results both in the New World and in the Old, and in the latter paved the way for that new epoch in history, which by the Greeks and Romans and by ourselves was looked upon as the infancy of history. That's the hijack. You see how they try to start history with Greeks and Romans, with their hijacks? What Greeks and Romans? Made up history. It is of this history alone that Herodotus was the father, but of the history before him we are only of late acquiring the rudiments. But before Greeks we don't know anything. Yeah, that's why you start off with so-called Greeks and Romans, because you don't know anything before that. And a dim conception from excavations and the exhumed relics of Akkadians, Sumerians, Khitans, Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese, Etruscans, Cypriotes, and others have still to come. It is to this intermediate epoch whereof there are some historical elements, as yet shapeless and incomplete, that the term protohistoric was some years since applied by me, and being found convenient, was adopted by others. The term prehistoric is not correct. For history there is better than is sometimes to be found of later periods, and the term prehistoric should be maintained for those conditions which according to its meaning are before history. The application of the facts, as ascertained by the ancient, is consistent with the conditions of America on the resumption of intercourse by the Spaniards. The effect of the stoppage of the navigation would be to deprive the 10 kingdoms of the Atlantic of their supply of trained Iberian civilians, warriors, navigators, and merchants, leaving the half-caste and native elements to acquire numerical preponderance. In fact, then, by the cessation of Iberian immigration, would occur what happened in our days by the rupture of intercourse with Old Spain after the wars of independence. The migration of Spaniards ceasing, we have seen Indian blood assuming preponderance, and although the people still speak Spanish and observe outwardly the new religion, the rulers of many republics are men of whole or have Indian blood. We still hear, as well recognizable by their features and their characters as by their histories. It is because history repeats itself that we can, from comparative history, too much neglected from our incomplete knowledge, obtain a better and more exact explanation of what we regard as events and facts. After the dissolution of the empire of Atlantis, the states becoming independent might retain for a longer or shorter period that ancient culture, but its ultimate extinction was certain by the influence of the new elements. The official languages would linger, but would be superseded by those of the dominant tribes, and these would find to be of the same real origin and mold as those of the Old World. New states and governments would fall by the diminished power cohesion and would, according to circumstances, hold a more or less decided position of culture or of savagery. Where the wild tribes invaded and overturned a kingdom to be again overturned by others, as we find in the latter history of Mexico, there would mythology, not language and culture, generally be affected. Hence we should look to find very different development at the period of the Spanish invasion than was to be found in the Old World, except in Africa. Indeed, in the Old World, that's the hijack, this is the Old World, but he's talking about over there. When he means Old World and he's talking about Babylonia and Egypt, he means Americas. Like, this is something the author's not aware of in his time. Indeed, in the Old World, Babylonia and Egypt had fallen for ages, and their whole material existence had been annihilated by alien preponderance. On the other hand, America was protected from Semites and Aryans. That's the hijack. This is the land of Shemites. You see what I'm saying? There was no corresponding stage to the absorption of Babylonia by Assyrians and Persians, and of Egypt by Greeks and Arabs. In America, the ancient culture languished, but it was more persistently maintained. This again must be repeated of Africa. So again, dodging hijack big time. This right here, he's going on a rant on his opinions of what he thinks about the ancient world right here, its connection to America and how America was separated from the old world. This is the old world. That's why they're not understanding, seeing everything in reverse. And this is something we have been able to become aware of now in our times. As to Europe, the effects of the catastrophe were more immediate and more complete. There must have been an epoch when the great king of the West, must have been in harmony with the ruler of the East. For the coast dominions of the Western Spain, Etruria and Mauritania were as fully Iberian, or whatever term is to be applied, as those of the East. It was long since shown by me that the topographical names of Hispania are identical those of Italia, Hellas, Asia Minor, Palestine. A severance having taken place, political hostility followed, and the fall of the great king of the West in reality weakened the conquerors and laid them open to the invaders lying behind them in the East. Support from the West they could no longer obtain, nor naval aid, and most probably some invasion by them of Hispania and other countries dissipated their local strength. All right, they're talking about Atlantis losing its colonies over there in Africa and Europe. We may very fairly argue this, for we find historically that Phoenicia, according to the Bible, an unsemitic country, fell under the hands of Semitic victors, taking their languages and religions. All right, so Phoenicians became Semitic, huh? Or were they always, some of them were Semitic? Phoenician just means seafarer. We then find the Phoenicians as traders and pirates, like I just said, pirates, in the sea, traders, merchants in the sea, in the Levant seas, all right, in the seas, like I just said, in advance of the Aryans who had penetrated into Hellas. The Phoenicians occupied another Iberian country when they conquered but did not found Carthage, again at Massilia, in Gaul, and more particularly in Hispania. Thus the Iberian races were deprived of power in Hispania, South Gaul, South Italia, Sicilia and the islands, Mauritania and Hellas. Lydia was probably the last stronghold in Western Asia that fell to the Persians, while though Etruria lingered, it ultimately succumbed to the Arian masters of Rome. What happened in the Britons must be chiefly matter of conjecture. Here too the Iberians were severed from their allies in the rest of the world, and their several branches of gainful commerce were cut off. After a time these were looked after by the newer comers, and the tin trade more particularly attracted foreign cupidity. The power of the Celtic invaders was, as we know, sufficiently great to cover these secluded regions and to make Celtic language ultimately universal. Part 8. It says here, the name Atalantis or Atlantis. Okay, here we go. The name Atalantis or Atlantis is by me taken as the name of the king and not as that of the land, and as the name of the king instead of Atlas. There is material enough to suggest the form Atalantis. Such form as Atlantis or Atalantis brings it into conformity with mythological and historical surroundings. In the course of my determinations and investigations of the Kita or Hamath inscriptions, by some called Hittite, a term calculated to mislead in reference to characters found over Western Asia, okay? Hittite is a bad way to call a person as a Kita or from Hamath, okay? Much attention was devoted by me to the bilingual in Kita, an Assyrian cuneiform known as the boss or seal of Tarkondemos or Tarkutimi, and on which some observations have been published by me. This object has been very fancifully treated, and as the figures on it are rudely or conventionally represented, various animals' forms have been attributed to them. It is, however, now recognized that, as stated by me, right, they are identical with characters natural or conventional, represented in the inscriptions of Hamas, Karchemish, Magnesia, Nymphi, etc., and that the signification is the title of the king, From that point, divergence into theory grows rife among writers. It has, however, been shown by me that the characters are identical with two types of the coins of Sardis, which represent the heads of a bull and a lion, and in an artistic form the figures of a bull and a lion. Sardis is close to the inscription of the pseudo-Sesostris and the Niobe, question mark, at Nymphi in Magnesia. From linguistic evidence, it has been decided by me that on the bust, the bull stands for Tara, listen, or Tar, Tara or Tartari, Tartarina, and the lion for Kun, or Ku, Timmy, or Demos, meaning offspring of children. In my paper contributed to the Royal Historical Society in 1882 on the early history of the Mediterranean populations in their migrations and settlements will be found at page 22, 24, and 25 some remarks on the adoption of the head as the type of the animal, illustrative of the Tarcodemos characters, and an application of the bull and lion of coins. In that treatise will be found several examples of cities of the form Tara Kona, having either a bull or a lion, or both as emblems. Such are, and these are all the cities he got here listed: Acanthus, Macedonia, right? Knidos, a lion. So in Macedonia, they got a bull and a lion. In Tarraco, in Spain, they got a bull. And Dyrrhachium, Illyria, they got a bull. Atrax, Thessaly, a bull. Taurini, Italy, a bull. Citium, Cyprus, a deer or lion. Catana, Sicily, a bull. And Panticapium, bull and lion. And Sibida or Kibuda, Phrygia, a bull and lion. Cyzicus, Cusicu, a calf and a lion. And Syracusa, look at that, Syracuse, Syracusa, Sicily, a bull. Chios Island, a lion. Morgantia, Sicily, a stag, a lion. All right. And it keeps going. Messana, Sicily, a calf, a lion. And Tarsus, Cilicia, bull and lion. Carthago in Africa, goat, lion. Sardis, Lydia, bull, lion. Segesta, Sicily, a stag, a lion. Sueza, Campania, bull, lion. And Samos Island, a bull and a lion. All right. You see, they all got the same emblems. Some connection there. Before commenting on this list, it's to be noted that Tara and Kona are not the only words used in the ancient languages for the bull and lion, nor are the words employed in the same order. Sardis appears to be Sara, Sala, bull, T, lion, compare Sura, Kusa. Acanthus is a Akantu, taking the form Tarkon, for in the Hamath inscriptions it is separable and found with or without the characters, right? These characters right here, these double lines, reading Timmy, Demos. We find many examples of it, all right? And so here's some more Tarku Timmy boss, all right? You guys can go ahead and pause the video and take a screenshot and take a look at this, all right? You guys can see what he's comparing. It keeps going down here. Tarakanauza, the name of Kita or Kitim, enumerated by Professor T.G. Chen, okay? The name of Kita or Kitim, Tarakanusa. The form is also to be found in the names of places. Besides Darkuan in Africa, we have the title Tarkun still preserved in central Tartary. All right, Tartary, here we go, for which the Bibliothèque Orientale of the Herbelot is quoted, page 847. Okay, so Tarkum, that word, that title is still used in central Tartary. He says that it is the title of a noble exempt from all kinds of taxes and from any contribution to the prince or general of plunder or booty he may have made in war. The Reverend Dr. Coeli informs me further that Senker in his Turkish dictionary explains the word as the title of a dignitary at the courts of the Tartar Khans. Okay? Tarkum, this guy is saying, Reverend Dr. Coeli, is the title of a dignitary at the courts of the Tartar Khans, priest kings, the Tartar, who enjoyed special privileges such as exemption from tribute, free access to the sovereign inviolability of person. These privileges are of a princely kind. Tarkun was also applied to a name, to a tribe of Jagata, Turks. Mr. W. St. Chad Boscawen suggested to me in 1880 that Tirhaka is one of the forms of Tarkon. Among the kingly names in the district of Sardis or Lydia, we find Candaulis, Tantalus, and in the Troad Dardanus. And the objects brought by Dr. Schleiman from the Troad inscriptions have been found by me, which appear to represent the kingly title. As to the Condaulis, which we are justified in treating as Condauris, we have Tarakon or Darakon reproduced. The name of the individual who was called Condaulis is said to have been Mercellus, so that as suggested here, Condaulis may have been the kingly title. On the other side, in Condaulis, Tantalus, and Dardanus, I was saying, look at this relation. Darda, we already know, is from the line of Sarah, Judah, right? Tara, remember Tara, Queen Tara. Tara in Ireland is linked to the same people. All right, what are we saying here? We get a form like Atalantis, Ataranti. What? Ataranti, Tartar. Atlantis is Tartary. Whoa. To this class perhaps belong Tyndarus, Codrus, Codarus, Deucalion, etc. Indeed, the names of the legendary kings may be recognized as belonging to such forms. There is an appearance that the numerous kings adopting the title of Tarkon differentiated themselves from each other by dialectical distinctions and by reversing the syllables. This title of Tarkon and its equivalence was the great and favorite title before the Semitic and Aryan epic. The bull is made the superior animal to the lion, but this is probably because the original king of beasts was the elephant and not the lion. As the elephant died out in the northern countries, he was replaced by the bull, the stag, and even the goat, Tragus, which Mr. Basil Cooper supposes to be the true representative of the Tarkon. Who? The goat, huh? Baphomet? The word for elephant and king shows some correspondence in African languages. Whether the bull and lion were totems or standards of the kings is matter of speculation, but a curious case of survival of the tradition is to be traced in the description of the legendary throne of King Solomon. All right? On the first step, the Reverend Dr. Lowy remarks the bull and the lion held their place. It is to be noted that on the bull's side was the sheep, and on the lion's, the leopard and the cat, right? The leopard or jaguar, maybe? With the savage birds, the eagle and the sparrowhawk. Yep, all American animals, right? So remember, now this is interesting, right? As we're reading, talking about the lion and the bull, we see that in a lot of the emblems, right? And the royal emblems. In reference to the coins Adarkonim and Darkemonen, great discussion has taken place among numismatists, as recorded by Mr. Madden in the 4th chapter of his work of great labor, on the coins of the Jews in the Numismata Orientalia. The general impression has been that the coin was the Daric of Darius, but Mr. Madden has given reason to doubt this conclusion. It so happens there is a passage of the Scholiast and Aristophanes, Ecclesiastes 6:02, and Harpocration and Suidas. All right, and all this Greek, is that Greek language? It says, this says Mr. Madden is particularly rejected by Mr. Hess as unworthy of credit. On consideration of the evidence given on the present occasion, the quotation in Harpocration may be taken as representing a real historical condition. There is likewise an appearance that coinage originated in Asia Minor, bearing the title or emblems of the Tarkon, and that in later stage it is represented by coins of Sardis. It is by no means impossible that with this point the date of events of Atalantis may have some connection, although in America a community of symbolism, character, and ornament with the old world may be traced, okay? May be traced. It is the old world. There is no such development as we find in the coinage and standards of the Mediterranean population. Look at that. There is no development, there's no origin, but in America there is. In America, there is. To this day, a crescent and star suggest the idea of Byzantium and is acknowledged there, just as an owl is accepted for Athens. The symbolism is, however, more particularly recorded in the vast number of coins of so many cities and islands. That the shells or cowries were an early form for money has been the opinion of many. The inscribed and sculptured worlds found by Dr. Schleiman have by me had a signification assigned them of being further form of money. The lumps of metal first coined at Sardis bear the same symbols as the spindle whorls. Using this adoption of gold, silver, and bronze coins as distinctive historic epoch, the alleged naval conflict of East and West and the severance of intercourse must have taken place anterior to it. Upon the eastern territories of the King of Atlantis, in Mauritania, Mr. R.G. Halliburton, Q.C. of Toronto, who has been so many years a laborer in prehistoric anthropology, is now engaged in researches and has discovered many interesting facts. All right, I wonder what he discovered. All right, we go to part 9. I think this is the last part, I'm not sure, but part 9, it says origin and distribution of the American and other languages. All right, for the drop, it says without including the Davenport, the Brazilian, Phoenician, and other controverted specimens, there is a large number of American rock inscriptions. All right, so remember, he's talking about the Davenport tablet, which we got videos on, where they found incredible old world inscriptions and this whole scene, a cremation scene and all that. It looks like the firmament and them they're having a ceremony. All right, so there's a lot of, he's saying, there's a large number of these type of tablets, American rock inscriptions, particularly those of Guyana, which show affinities with those of the old world. All right, they all have old world inscriptions or writing. This is the old world. They're finding it here, guys. Let's be logical. Come on. The inscriptions of Yucatan and Lake Titicaca as well. So in Mexico and Bolivia, as well as the Mexican characters. Even our present state of knowledge suggests a common origin with the East through an independent development. A popular example may be taken in the Mexican use of tooth for mountain. The same is found in the Old World symbology, and as in other cases, it is dependent on common laws of symbolism and linguistic formation, under which tooth, mountain, arrow, and similar forms were arranged in series and in speech represented by dentals. Another correspondence and a different branch is to be found in the well-known illustration of the Mexican anthropological figure of the human body, in which each limb and member is represented by a zodiacal sign or numeral, many of which can be traced in languages or symbols of the old world. Because this is, again, the old world. This is the true old world. That's why they're finding all this stuff here. Dr. Tyler has illustrated systems of numeration by touching various features of the face. Having been engaged for a long time on the investigation of the connection of characters in speech, which was illustrated in papers to the British Association, Society of Biblical Archaeology, Anthropological Institute, etc., I was led by observations by Mr. Alfred R. Wallace in Nature in 1881 to the true key. It was evident to me, from Chinese more particularly, that ancient characters representing a round object as eye, sun, moon, mouth, etc., were naturally as ideographs, round, but also that the sounds were of the same class, in this case, labials. My supposition for many years had been that they turned as a central type on the eye. Mr. Wallace said, when we name the mouth or lips, we use labials for teeth and tongue dentals for the nose and things relating to it nasal sounds, and this peculiarity is remarkably constant in most languages, civilized and savage. His examples were given from Australia, but the best examples for us are the words as we have them in English, mouth, tooth, nose, as they familiarly give the types. Of course, this incident of itself would give us but a very small stock of language, but to me, having the materials at hand, it afforded the key, for it brought out that the old Chinese round characters were allied to mouth, and consequently thereby labials, and only allied to eye secondarily, and it enabled me to show how speech and characters were formed by my article in Nature. Wow, that's pretty interesting stuff right here, right? Instead of referring to this paper, it is better to give the results as confirmed by further investigations of words and characters. On examining the ancient and modern syllabaries and alphabets, they can generally be recognized as not only ideographic but phonetic in relation to the law of classification. Of this, there are some interesting examples in connection with America, but for which there is no space now. Thus, characters to be considered as strictly in psychological connection with speech. On going again over Colonel Mallory's researches on gesture and sign language, there is further to be recognized a connection of gesture, speech, and character. And in this precise connection, it can be seen as already stated that speech is in succession to gesture and not precedent to it, and that many characters, not strictly ideographic in writing, belong in origin to gesture and not to speech. A remarkable series of researches by a distinguished scholar, Dr. Karl Abel, are just beginning to attract attention in Germany and England, but are little understood. In original investigations of ancient Egyptian and Coptic, he found that the same or similar sounds had opposite meanings and were affirmative or negative. On following this up in other languages with which he is familiar, he came across the same facts, though not so strongly apparent as in Egyptian. The real explanation is to be found in the original relationship of speech language to gesture language, where the meaning of a sign depends on the significant gesture, affirmative or negative applied. Hence, in some languages, adjectives are made not good, not great, not black, etc. It is possible that explanatory tones applied to give meanings to words in Chinese are due to the same influence of origin. Two circumstances must, however, be taken into account: that in gesture the real center is the lower part of the body, and that the effective application of speech, labials, for instance, is due to the transposition of the center to the mouth in the upper half of the body. All right. So interesting what he's talking about here. We're talking about philology right here, right? And the origin, the study of language and speech and words, right? This enables the labial sounds M, B, and to be applied to round characters and ideas expressive of a round object. But from the very beginning of speech, a cause of disturbance was thereby introduced. The labial forms are generally regarded as female and the nasal as male. But under various conditions of symbology and classification, a labial may be displaced by another sound. This is notably the case with the eyes. A common type is labial, but as in American languages, at present, a nasal or dental may be more prominent. Wow, so more male? One cause is that under symbolism, the two eyes themselves are distinctly male and female, with separate names. Hence, dissyllable names for the eyes. Under the conditions of male and female languages, that is, separate words used by males and separate words used by females, wow. As is found in America, interference and disturbance will be observed, but the general and fundamental law is that the labial, nasal, and dental were applied according to certain psychological considerations. Hence, it appears that the foundation of speech, which must have taken place in the Eastern world and been transmitted to America, that's the hijack, must have, he doesn't know. This is the farthest East. This is the true East. Flip the maps. It's not due to one primeval language in the accepted sense, but to the relations to be observed among all languages, and particularly those of the Western Hemisphere, to those of the Eastern, and which are to be attributed to the application of one law and not of one type. Thus, if we take labials, we do not find one labial dominating, but the labial may be M, B, W, etc., as if a law had been given forth by the propagators of speech that the round form were to be represented by a labial. Of course, it has been laid down that according to Grimm's law, such forms are only degradations in series, but on careful observation, it can be seen that many of the existing forms are aboriginal. Are what? Are aboriginal, and that they must come under Dr. Tyler's doctrine of differentiation. There is no opportunity here, perhaps no necessity for developing all the considerations of the subject, but at all events we get what we never had before, a consistent explanation of the phenomena of the distribution and coincidences of speech language, as also of those of gesture language and of characters as basis for historical research. By the founders of speech, must these new speech languages have been distributed in America? And the suggestion naturally is that such intercourse had already taken place equally in the epoch of gesture language. The effect of introducing speech language was to produce in the world of a psychological revolution, and this appears to be represented in the legends either as the creation of man or as the second creation of man, and in the legend of the ark, when new men were carried over the waters, commonly called the deluge legend. The rapidity and completeness of the occupation of the world by the races which propagated the new culture, and the reduction of so many thousand tribes must have depended not on warlike conquest, but upon the divine influence of speech, introduced by missionaries and emissaries. In many traditions, we find these bearded white men coming by sea. Bearded, white bearded. See, they flipped it. It actually says white bearded man, not bearded white man. That's the hijack with these people and their pro-white supremacist ancient people view. Man. Coming by sea, introducing speech and other arts, and founding kingdoms or being treated as divine personages, right? Where's your quote for that? Where's your original primary source where it says bearded white men? What are you talking about? What traditions? One of the most interesting examples for study is perhaps that of Tierra del Fuego, right? That's the tip of South America. And that's actually what Antarctica used to be called, Tierra del Fuego, land of fire, huh? The missionaries have lately put into print one of the three languages, the Yagan, spoken by a few hundred savages. On examining the vocabulary, as stated by me at the last meeting of the British Association, 1883, most of the words can be sharply identified with those of West Africa. Listen, they went from there. So what happened to all the Indians that were there? Because there was a lot of Indians in these areas, Tierra del Fuego and all that. You know, and colonial times they got enslaved. Where did they end up? And we got the drop on that. We actually have reports of all these people being taken and enslaved, right? So their languages and Tierra del Fuego match a lot of the West African, huh? And further, they can be compared with languages of the ancient world and with the greatest language of the modern world. It is for others to explain, if they will not let me explain, how this mass of sounds having definite psychological relations could be transported from Western Africa to the extremity of South America. The favorite theory of independent generation, and that this had been exerted by Jagan savages, is utterly excluded by the facts, all right? So again, he's seeing it in reverse. He's seeing it with out of Africa theories, all right? But we already know they went from here to Africa. Most of those people in West Africa weren't even there. We got a lot of trouble. They were coming from really Asia, India, Pakistan, you know, Middle East, you know. They weren't even there. The oldest people in West Africa, the Khoisan, right, and the Pygmy tribes. So, this is the favorite theory of independent generation, that this had been exerted by Jagan savages, is utterly excluded by the facts. The grammar is of very remarkable character, but the words tell their own tale of transplantation by a race of high culture, as is the case indeed with all the American languages, all right, high culture. It has happened, and the authors have been treated as charlatans. That books have been written with great labor to show the relations of Quichua, Aymara, and many Western languages with Coptic, Semitic, and most dissimilar Eastern languages. The facts of such resemblances remain positive and palpable, notwithstanding all errors of comparison or of the conclusion of the author. Even in this day, where we see the development of great events and revolutions, and particularly with regard to the Western world, which already holds so great a share in the influence of the 100 million of the English-speaking races, it is strange to speculate in the spirit of the ancient dialogues, when we see Athens put forward as the center of actions and the decision of the destinies of other hemisphere. We may well contemplate what might have happened in the intercourse had been maintained if the Western king had grown in power in Athens and this island were now dependent dominions. What if Atlantis or America kept its power? That's what he's asking. What if we were to make, what if we, kept that empire we had worldwide? In science, there is no orthodoxy and no finality. Schools of thought reign and perish, but truth abides. The possibility that always remains to us is to persevere and research and in progress. All right. And that's the end of this book, But look what it said here. It's a fact that the Quechua and Aymara and many Western languages, Coptic and Semitic, they have relations with the Semitic, with the Hebrew, Quechua, all right? Atlantis is America, all right? I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me read this whole book. There goes another book. You guys read a whole book again. Congratulations. There you go, another book down. Thank you for doing that, spending the time with me. I hope you got something valuable out of this. I appreciate you guys always. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.